Israel and Poland, the diplomatic equivalent of frenemies. The Holocaust, nearly 75 years on, is driving a major rift between the two allies. First, a Polish law that would criminalise accusations of Polish complicity in the Holocaust was seen as historical revisionism by Israel. That was followed by a series of controversial comments from leaders of both nations. Now, Poland has turned away a visiting Israeli delegation, and I24 News diplomatic correspondent Mike Wagenheim explains why.
This is getting ugly. Israel and Poland are supposedly allies, but they sure don't act that way. On Monday, the hard-right Polish government canceled a trip by a delegation of Israeli officials. Israel said they wanted to make the restitution of Jewish property stolen during the Holocaust a topic of discussion. The Poles say Israel threw them a curveball at the last minute. They're not talking about restitution, unless it's Germany paying them for invading Poland. It's just the latest in a series of Holocaust-related issues that have kept the Israel-Polish relationship on a low simmer at best and a high flame at worst over the last 2 years.
We must stand our ground. We should tell them what we think, the way we think it and the way we feel it, and we should represent first and foremost the memory of the dead. And if they don't like it, so be it.
Poland is one of a handful of European countries without a law dealing with the restitution of property stolen during the Holocaust. Last year, Serbia joined a long list of nations with legislation on the books, though restitution proponents are pushing a few select countries to do more to process claims and open up eligibility. Other countries have a compensation mechanism or claim that compensation would be too complicated or costly to implement. The Poles are alone, though, in saying they owe nothing, and they emphasize they won't be pressured by a new U.S. law that essentially documents restitution deadbeats. After the latest diplomatic tear, can the Israel-Polish relationship be salvaged?
There's no moral justification in backing up on the memory of those who perished during the Holocaust. And the fact that the Israeli government and the Israeli Prime Minister has decided to negotiate with the Polish government about what is ours or the family's properties that were left behind is, to me, unbearable.
Mike Wagenheim, I24 News.
All right, let's bring in our Europe correspondent, Polina, who's at the Conference of European Rabbis, and with me in studio, our senior international affairs correspondent, Owen Alterman. Polina, we'll start with you. Poland is the only European Union country that hasn't passed laws regulating the compensation of looted or national property. Why is that?
Well, for years, Poland has been claiming that it's simply too poor to afford such compensations, which were recently estimated by Poles as much as $300 billion. They were saying that simply cannot afford this. And we also saw officials within the Polish government over the years express regret over this. In 2017, the then the Deputy Justice Minister for Poland said that he regrets not being able to introduce such a law. But now we see a different kind of narrative. It's Polish government saying that even if they could afford it, they simply don't think that they should pay. They think if anybody is entitled for compensations, they are the ones that are entitled from the Germans for invading their company. And since Germany did not compensate them enough, according to Polish estimates, a Polish narrative, then there's no reason for them to compensate the Jewish population that was forced to escape.
Oh, and to Polina's point there, the Poles say that they are the ones that deserve to be compensated, at least in this instance. Have they been compensated for their loss in World War II?
Well, first of all, Tracy, I think you have to make a distinction between Poles as a group, as a society, and individual Poles, although there are very, very many of them, who themselves had property taken. I mean, just to take a step back at the history, World War II breaks out. Of course, the Germans invade Poland on September 1st, 1939, then occupy the country for the better part of 6 years. And then afterwards, of course, Poland is taken over by a communist government that basically nationalizes a lot of the property. Now, you have to understand that during the war, much of Poland was absolutely destroyed. 90%, I think, of Warsaw completely destroyed. And you certainly see that on the streets there with all the buildings that have very clearly come up since World War II and the entire historic center basically being destroyed. So again, large parts of the country destroyed. The communists then come in and nationalize a lot of the property. Since 1989, a lot of people have come up and said, hey, look, that property was mine. Whether they be non-Jewish Poles, whether they be the descendants of those who were killed in the Holocaust or those who themselves survived the Holocaust, whether they be in Poland in small numbers or in the United States or Israel or elsewhere. But again, Tracy, this is a problem that is just so enormous that it seems that awfully hard to solve. Although, again, of course, there are many cries for justice by those who lost their property, again, particularly those killed in the Holocaust and those families, and, of course, the Poles who had their property taken as well.